r/NoSleep. Posted by u/10minute horror. My friends went camping on a forbidden island and now I can't find them. I never enjoyed camping. I savored the comfortability that modern life affords. But every year, my old group of high school friends would go up to the same lake and set up tents on the same shorefront and drink the same beers and tell the same stories. I always did enjoy that. It was kind of like having a bad job, but all your coworkers were awesome, making it just bearable. So for 2 to 3 days a year, I put myself through shitting in the woods for the laughs that came with it. We'd all drive up on the Friday after work, and usually take the Monday off and stay until then. We'd park and hike 2 kilometers along the water to the campsite we always went to and set up there for the long weekend. The last time we went camping, I was running late. I had a project to finalize and it kept being sent back by my boss to be tweaked. I couldn't leave the city with my girlfriend, Kat, until after 9 p.m. A storm was at our backs the whole drive up to the country, and it seemed to be headed right where we were. Then we hit traffic. An 18-wheeler had jackknifed and the road was getting cleaned up. The pre-storm rain caught up to us. Kat and I didn't get to the turnoff for the camp parking lot until after midnight. I recognized all 4 of my friends' cars parked near the waterfront. Then a flurry of texts came in from my buddy Jeremy. Reception was spotty out there so you could never really count on communication that way. The texts had been sent a few hours apart. Jeremy told me they'd switched sites this year, and that they'd finally made it to the island. The island was always spoken of as being forbidden, mostly because it was near impossible to get to. It was diamond-shaped, but longer than it was wide. It was surrounded by sharp rocks and filled with dense trees. A heavy current came at it from head-on, so it split the rush of water to both sides. This made it impossible to reach, because the only side that wasn't overcome with rapids and sharp rocks was the back side, which had a high, rocky cliff that jutted up 30 feet above the water. The cliff had a large, flat surface that looked out onto the lake and would have been the perfect campsite, if only it was accessible. Because of the heavy rapids and rocks, it remained untouched and was the place everyone wanted to camp, but no one could. Kayakers and boaters even avoided the rapids around it because of how sharp the rocks were. It was beautiful to look at, but treacherous and potentially fatal to attempt to conquer. That year, there'd been a serious drought in the county. It hadn't rained in weeks, so the water was down and the rocky lake bed of the rapids were exposed. You could now walk across to the island. Jeremy said the group made a snap decision. They trekked across and camped on the side everyone had always wanted to. He told me they'd set up their tents on the rock slab that overlooked the lake, and they'd save me a spot somewhere near the back. I felt uneasy reading the texts. I didn't know much about the lake or water flow systems in general, but with the storm at our backs, who knew how long the rapids would stay down? We could get trapped on the island. Kat felt uneasy about it too. But we packed all our gear and made the trek along the waterfront to our normal campsite. From there, we could see the island and all my friends' tents set up on the rock slab that overlooked the lake. The storm had caught up to us and the rain was getting heavier. Kat and I decided to stay at our normal spot for the night, and I set up a tarp overhead so we could pitch the tent without getting everything soaked. When that was done, we were both exhausted and she crawled into her sleeping bag. But I ventured out in my rain slicker to the edge of the lake. I sent a few texts to Jeremy and the others. None of them went through though. I looked out at the island, which was 100 yards away, and focused on the tents. Only 2 tents were visible, both with stationary lights turned on inside, causing them to glow like fireflies in the dark landscape. I couldn't see any movement though. But that wasn't surprising, it was late. They'd all probably gone to bed. As I turned back to my tent, my flashlight caught strange shapes of rocks in the dried-up rapids. Like they all had abnormally curved edges. I didn't think much of it and joined Kat in the tent. When Kat and I woke up the next morning, it was still dark out even though it was past 10 a.m. The storm was growing heavier. We put rain gear on and went to the edge of the lake to look out at the island. The storm had caused the water to rise. Just a few inches higher, but it was starting to move quickly. The visible tents looked the same on the rock slab. The flashlights were still on and in the same positions. No movement. We figured the idiots were probably still drunk or hungover and had no idea what the situation with the storm was. I yelled across to the island but the rain and thunder masked my voice. Kat and I talked about it and we decided to trek across the rocky floor of the lake while we could. We climbed down to the lake bed, which was 5 or 6 feet below, and made our way through the muddy and rocky terrain. As we got closer to the island, I noticed the strange shaped rocks I saw the night before. There were a lot more than I'd previously seen. In fact, they seemed to surround the entire island. There were rows of sharp rocks jutting up all over and huge, pointed boulders with multiple, curved and sharp edges. None of them looked naturally eroded and formed by time. Though they did show aging. They looked like they'd been sharpened like fishhooks. No wonder kayakers and boaters didn't come this way. As I looked closer, I saw strange inscriptions carved into the sharper, hooked rocks. The carvings were deteriorating, but I could tell they were symbols. Someone, long ago, was responsible for these symbols and hooks. We continued towards the island, narrowly avoiding the pointed rocks and slippery ground. Along the edge of the island, we found a portion of the rocks that opened up and gave an entrance. We climbed the rocks and made our way onto the island. The woods were dense and dark, so we decided to move along the side of the island and up towards the rock slab and campsite. The storm was starting to get heavier and made the climb up hard. But we found our way to the campsite and saw 4 tents. There was a fire pit that was waterlogged now, some beer bottles and cigarette butts, loose garbage and foldable chairs. But no people. None of my friends were there. We looked inside all the tents and everyone's belongings were still there. But they, themselves, were missing. Kat thought maybe they were in the woods. Maybe, even, they'd found a cabin or shack on the interior. Something to investigate or ride out the storm in. Then I saw the carvings. The giant slab of stone we were standing on had lines of the same symbols from the hooked rocks on the lake bed. Kat noticed them too and mentioned they looked indigenous. We found a rough pathway into the woods, but the path wasn't more than just trampled grass, shrubs and bushes and some beer cans and cigarette butts. We followed the trail as it led further into the island's interior. The dense trees blocked out the rain from above and any light the sky was giving off was long gone. The interior quickly felt like night and the sounds of the storm drowned out. All we could hear were the tall, swaying trees overhead as we moved through the mossy and vine-filled woods. The trail of cans and butts came to an end and the path disappeared. We thought about turning back. But then we heard something. A whimper. Coming from somewhere ahead. It was animalistic. It sounded pained and afraid, whistling upwards at the end of each whine. I continued forward, Kat following behind me. On the path ahead, there was a long, nylon-looking rope. We followed it, and found it leading us to the source of the whimpering. I realized I wasn't following a rope. It was a leash. Jeremy's pit bull, Oscar, was crouched under an upturned tree, trembling. He had several, small slashes across his body. None were very deep. But they all looked like they hurt. We approached him calmly and managed to lead him out from under the roots of the tree. As we inspected him, it was undeniable that he was attacked by an animal. Kat and I whispered to each other, deciding to take Oscar, get off the island and hike back to the car for cell reception. Something really bad had clearly happened. We cut to the right, heading directly for the edge of the island and not back through the woods the way we came. Not back to the tents. Then we heard more sounds ahead of us, echoing through the dark trees. Cracks. Snaps. Breaks. It sounded like someone was splitting thick tree branches. Oscar started whimpering again and pulled away. Kat took that as a sign and started backing up with Oscar. She motioned for us to go to the opposite side of the island and cross there. But I needed to see what the sounds were. I motioned for her to go ahead and I crept forward, through more trees, towards the cracking. Up ahead, I could see a small clearing in the woods. I peeked out into it and saw the leaves and grass were red. In the center, there was a hole dug into the side of a large hill. There were clothes strewn about, all stained with the same browning red shade. Then I saw the bodies. If you could call them that. I saw Jeremy first, though it was difficult to tell it was him aside from the bright neon hunting slicker he always wore. His body, like the others, had been viciously opened up and exposed like a fillet. To his left was the source of the sounds. One of my friends, Tim I think, was ripped in 2 pieces. Something was crouched between the 2 halves of his body. Some kind of tall, skinny, ghastly creature. The beast was all earth tone, greens and blacks and browns. It had tufts of thick, coarse black hair sticking out of various parts of its leathery skin. It was strong and powerful and was clawing through the meat of Tim's thighs. The creature pulled out Tim's femur and bit down into it. I looked around at the other bodies and realized they were all missing their bones. The creature didn't eat their skin, muscle or fat. It wasn't interested in meat. It just wanted to eat their bones, which had been torn, pulled, and ripped away from muscles and ligaments. Even the craniums had been broken apart, the insides cast aside as the skull was devoured. I watched the creature's jaw grind down on Tim's femur. The chewing was horrifying. The breaking, crushing and pulverizing of bone. Then the femur snapped and the familiar crack filled the woods again. A whimper came from the woods behind me. From Oscar. The creature jerked in my direction. I ducked behind a tree before it saw me, but I knew it'd be coming. It heard Oscar. In a low, crouched position, I started rushing back through the woods, following the path Cat and Oscar made. But I wasn't as quiet as I hoped and sticks were cracking under my feet, echoing through the trees. A screech roared out from the woods behind me. I ran faster, knowing the creature was definitely aware other people were on the island now. It's silent. I heard branches breaking and heavy movement behind me as the creature gained. Then I started to hear the storm again. The trees were becoming less dense and I was getting to the other side of the island. I saw an opening up ahead and rushed to it. I got to the edge of the island and was greeted by a raging thunderstorm. The water had risen and the rapids were back, though they were half their normal height. I looked over to the shore and saw Cat and Oscar made it across. I climbed down quickly and started trying to make my way to them. The rapids were at my waist and pushing hard. I kept grabbing onto the larger rocks for support, but all their sharpened edges kept cutting my hands. Then Cat screamed. She was staring behind me. At the island. I turned back, only for a moment, and saw the creature had climbed down to the lake bed and was following me through the growing rapids. The creature was taller than me and moved faster than I did, but it had the same problems trying to get a footing. I kept going, Cat yelling for me to hurry, the beast behind me gaining. It was only feet away from me now, and its long, splintered claws were almost able to grab my shoulder. It swung at me, narrowly missing. I was still another 20 yards from Cat in the shorefront, and I knew the creature would catch me on the next claw swing down. The only thing I could think to do was let my legs go out from under me. Just before the creature swung down, I let my legs go limp. My body was immediately rushed forward with the rapids and before I knew it, I was 30 yards downriver. But I slammed into one of the boulders and a row of sharp rocks dug into my side and ripped through my bicep and into my arm. Another, sharper and pointier rock went right through my shoulder. It was incredibly painful, especially with the water pushing me away from the boulder, causing the wounds to open and tear. I heard that horrible screech again and looked up to see the creature had done what I'd done. Only the rapids had carried it further to the right. A sharp, long rock was sticking through the creature's abdomen. It had been impaled and was trying to pull itself forward and off, but the hooked edge of the tip was too jagged and the rapids kept hitting the creature, forcing it back to the hilt. The creature didn't look like it was going to get free, and I realized I'd suffer the same fate if I didn't get loose from the rock I'd been snagged on. I managed to pull myself forward and free from the rocks that had lodged in my arm and shoulder. The hooks on the ends tore off a good chunk of skin and meat when I did. But I was free. I slipped and struggled and fought my way to the shore, where Cat and Oscar were waiting. I rolled both ankles and could barely stand. Cat helped me up and we looked back at the rapids. The creature was being overcome by the rising water and heavy current. We could only see it from the chest up now, and it was beginning to give up. But when it saw us watching, it got a jolt of energy and was making a final attempt to pull itself off the rock. We didn't wait around to see if it did. I did my best to rush with Cat and Oscar through the woods and we found a cottage not too far. We called the police from there and a huge investigation started. But ultimately, all that was released to us or the public was there'd been a wild animal attack that had left several young adults dead, on an island they weren't supposed to be on. I still think back to the rocks and boulders surrounding the island. The sharp ones. The ones I'd been stuck to and the creature died on. Up close, they were all stony fish hooks. I always thought fish hooks were used to catch something to eat. But I was starting to think these ones were used to catch something trying to escape. Whoever sharpened those rocks, however they did it, knew what they were doing.